All right, so we're ready today to continue on in our study of John. All right, we concluded Christ's prayer to the Father last time in chapter 17. So today we're ready to pick up here in chapter 18. In verse 1, it says, "When Jesus had spoken these words, after he finished the prayer to his Father, he went out with his disciples over the brook Kidron. Now, since they had left the upstairs room, the upper room as we have in the King James, earlier, back in chapter 14, verse 31, is when they left the upper room. Now we're all the way to chapter 18. Here we find at the very beginning of this chapter, they crossed the brook that runs basically through the Kidron Valley. They went over the brook Kidron. Kidron Valley, is on the east side of the city. So if they went out, but they left the upper room 3 chapters ago, and now we have them going out again, John must here be referring to them leaving the city, coming through the gates, or coming out of the gate, one of the gates of Jerusalem. And again, we think it was probably the Essene gate. And that's what it means when it says went out. They went out from the city, not out from the upper room. Most of the commentaries get this thing totally messed up because they say one of the synoptic accounts says this, another says that. So these guys didn't know what they were saying. No, each one had their own personal witness that they were supposed to record. Now, the Kidron Valley is a ravine that divided Jerusalem from the Mount of Olives and runs southward along the east side of the city. It starts up at Mount Scopus is kind of where it starts, and it comes down. I mean, that's really the head. The beginning of the Kidron Valley is not too far from where the Temple Mount is, but it goes, back then it was on the east side of the city. Today the city's spread out all over, but the old city, from the old city, it's on the east side of the old city. The Hinnom Valley enters into the Kidron Valley from the west, just south of what's called the city of David, where David, the original city that he took over from the Jebusites, was. And there, just after the Hinnom Valley runs into the Kidron Valley, the Kidron Valley then begins to bend off to the east, and then it continues to extend southeast of the city for approximately 20 miles until it basically dumps into the area of the Dead Sea. So that's the Kidron Valley. The only time it flowed with water, because it calls it here the brook Kidron, the only time that it would flow with water, at least between Jerusalem and the Mount of Olives, was in the winter and in the springtime after some significant rains. So it says brook Kidron, over there they call them wadis. It may have had some water in it because we're in the springtime. So there could have been water running through it. At any rate, they went over the brook Kidron. Now, according to the accounts of Matthew and Mark, after leaving the city, while they were walking to the Mount of Olives, Jesus, let's go back to Mark chapter 14 and pick this up, but Jesus began preparing the disciples for the events that would soon begin and carry over through the next several days. And here in Mark 14, verse 27, it says, "Then Jesus said to them, 'All of you will be made to stumble because of me this night. For it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered. But after I have been raised, I will go before you to Galilee.' Peter said to him, 'Even if all are made to stumble, yet I will not be.'" I'm not going to be made to stumble. I'll be right by your side. Jesus said to him, "Assuredly, I say to you that today, even this night, before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. But he spoke more vehemently, "If I have to die with you, I will not deny you." And they all said likewise. All right, so that happened after they left the city, or maybe as they were leaving through the city gates, after they were out privately enough. That's what he tells them. I'm going to go before you to Galilee. So that's what he told Peter. Now, we know Peter earlier said, "Oh, I'll die with you if I have to." If I can't follow you now, I'll follow you wherever you go. All right? So twice, on two different occasions, Peter had to be corrected and told, you're going to not deny me. And it's going to happen. We saw it happen, earlier in the upstairs room, before they left the upstairs room. Because Jesus was telling them, I'm going to go to my Father, and where I go, you can't come now. You're going to be able to come later, but not now. And Peter says, oh, yeah. And then he tells him then. You put the accounts together, Jesus must have told him this twice on two different occasions. All right, going on here in chapter 18 of John, verse 1, they went over the brook Kidron, where there was a garden, which he and his disciples entered. The garden was named Gethsemane, which simply means oil press, and it's believed to have been located on the lower western slope of the Mount of Olives. The accounts of Matthew and Mark reveal that upon arrival, Jesus told all of the disciples, except for Peter, James, and John, to sit down and wait while he took those three with him to another part of the garden in order to pray in a private area. When they reached that private place, he told those three, Peter, James, and John, that he was in very grave anguish or great anguish, and he told them to stay alert while he went a little further from them and knelt down to pray to the Father. Now, again, back to Mark chapter 14 and verse 36. This was what he prayed. Mark 14:36. And he said, Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Take this cup away from me. Nevertheless, not what I will, but what you will. Now, even though his prayer to the Father prior to leaving the city, as we saw last time, during that time he was very excited. He was excitedly looking forward to the culmination of his mortal life and receiving the glory, re-receiving the glory of eternal life that he had surrendered in order to become flesh and blood. He had now come to the appointed time for the fulfillment of the horrible things that were prophesied for him to suffer. He had no doubt during his lifetime witnessed scourgings. He had witnessed people who had been crucified. He had seen those things and was keenly aware of the great pain and suffering that he was destined to endure over the course of the next several hours before dying. Being overcome with human emotion and influenced by the human instinct of self-preservation, he appealed to the Father here in this prayer that's recorded at least in the synoptics. He appealed to the Father to spare him from the harsh pain that he was facing. Yet, being aware that he was under those human influences, he qualified his request with the conditional stipulation here, not what I will, but what you will. And by doing so, he expressed his full submission to the will of the Father. Even though he was struggling with his human emotions, and at that time, he still remained totally, fully committed to doing the Father's will, which that's what he said. He came to fulfill the Father's will. That's what he told everyone back in chapter 6. I think it's 37, 38 for the verse. But he says this, I've come to do the will of the Father. I haven't come to do my will. I've come to do the will of the Father, which basically was his will as well, because he had already volunteered to give his life. So it was to do the Father's will. And anything that it was the Father's will, it was going to take precedent over his. Now, according to the accounts in Matthew and Mark, Jesus prayed the same prayer, the exact prayer, 3 times. And each time, after he had prayed this particular prayer, he came to Peter, James, and John. Each time he came, he found them sleeping instead of being on watch. This was, again, what he was experiencing with them. Going on in chapter 18, verse 2, and Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place. That is, he knew where Gethsemane was. He was aware of it, for Jesus often met there with his disciples. Then Judas, having received a detachment of troops, or as the New American Standard has here, Roman cohort, a Roman cohort, wasn't a full cohort. A cohort was like 600 men. But from a Roman cohort, there were a few soldiers, Roman soldiers, who accompanied. And officers from the chief priests and Pharisees came there with lanterns, torches, and weapons. Judas and the mob arrived immediately, according to the synoptic accounts. They arrived immediately after Jesus had returned from praying the third time and had awakened Peter, James, and John from going to sleep once more. The mob, again, which included a few Roman soldiers, came to arrest Jesus, acting on the authority of the Sanhedrin. Now, apparently, the high priest had gone to Pilate or sent word that he needed a few Roman soldiers in order to execute an arrest, because it was actually the Jews arresting him, not the Romans, but the Romans were there to officially oversee what was going on. Going on in verse 4, Jesus, therefore, knowing all things that would come upon him, went forward and said to them, "Whom are you seeking?" They answered him, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus said to them, "I am." And Judas, who betrayed him, also stood with them. Then, when he said to them, "I am," they drew back and fell to the ground. As Jesus identified himself as the I am, the power of God in him overwhelmed this mob that had come to apprehend him, showing that he could not be taken by them if it were not his will. Can't do it. All he would have to do is say the word, they'd fall down again. It was after this that Judas came forward to kiss Jesus, to identify him so that they would make no mistake who it was who had spoken before they arrested him. That's according to Matthew's account. Just before Judas did kiss him, however, Jesus again exhibited his omniscience by asking Judas, and this is recorded in Luke 22, in Luke's account, he asked Judas, "Are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss?" So, again, Judas had made arrangements earlier. I'm going to kiss the one so that you don't make any mistake. You know, as soon as I do it, you come and grab him. And this was what he had said. I'll kiss him. This was the kiss of betrayal. Verse 7, then he asked him again. That is, Jesus asked them again, "Whom are you seeking?" And they said, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus answered, "I have told you that I am. Therefore, if you seek me, let these go their way," that is, his disciples, "that the saying might be fulfilled, which he spoke, of those whom you gave me, I have lost none." That was in the prayer that he made to the Father in chapter 17. Of all you have given me, I've lost none, except, of course. Now, quite possibly, the only disciples with him at this point were Peter, James, and John, since they were the three who were with him during the time that he prayed to the Father, and the mob showed up right then. Now, the other disciples could have heard the mob coming, obviously did, and saw the lights, and they may have, followed the mob on as well. No doubt eventually they did, but they may have been the only three there initially. John links Jesus' authoritative instructions to the mob to the fulfillment of the declaration he made again concerning not any of his followers being, not losing any of the followers that the Father had given him. Now, in this case, not losing any that he had been given, in this case, they would not be arrested and put to death, which would prevent them from being sent as apostles to bear witness of him later on. He wouldn't lose any. In this case, again, we're talking about those that had been trained as apostles, those the Father had given him to be used as apostles. Jesus was fully in charge of this encounter. He voluntarily surrendered himself to arrest. He voluntarily did that and dictated how his disciples were to be treated. You're not going to do anything with these. You're just not going to do anything with these. Now, since Judas was selected as the betrayer, he had never been given to Jesus as a true disciple. We know that going back to chapter 12. He was not given by the Father to be a true disciple, to be judged for salvation at that time, and perform the work of an apostle, because he was unfit for that job. He was a thief, and it was known that he was a thief. Jesus saw his character from the time that he selected him to be one of the 12 to begin with. Verse 10, Then Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. Now, it was probably when the armed men began to approach Jesus, as Mark tells us, you have to put all the accounts together, that the disciples asked Jesus at that point. Mark tells us this. They ask, and again, it would have to be James, Peter, and John. They, is this the time? Should we use the swords that we brought? Is it time for us to use those swords? At which Peter, maybe Peter wasn't asking. Maybe the other two, James and John, were asking while Peter was already in the process of swinging the sword. But he was prompted to act. He was probably aiming for a much more substantial part of the body than the ear, because I don't know that Peter was trained in the use of a sword to be able to do something that keen. And so Malchus probably ducked as this thing goes over his head and lost his ear. Now, Malchus may have been, because it says here he was a servant of the high priest. So he may have been the official representative of the high priest. And as such, he was the leader of the mob. He would have been the closest that was approaching when Peter swung the sword. Now, John doesn't mention, although we do have that information in Luke's account, that Jesus reattached Malchus's ear and healed him. That miracle was no doubt so well known that John didn't see any reason to include that. People would have already been aware of that at an earlier time. Verse 11, Then Jesus said to Peter, Put your sword into the sheath. Shall I not drink the cup which my Father has given me? Matthew's account includes Jesus pointing out to Peter that all who use the sword will perish with the sword. But Matthew is the only account that brings that out. He also reminded Peter that he could have all of the angelic protection that he wanted if he were simply to ask for it. That, again, is recorded by Matthew. And, of course, his refusal, Christ's refusal to do so, indicated his total commitment to fulfilling the will of the Father. In his prayer, which was concluded just before the mob arrived, he asked if the cup, and he says, Father's given me the cup, and I've got to drink it. He asked if the cup could pass from him, and then acknowledged the impossibility. At least back in Matthew's account, Matthew chapter 26 is where that parallels this material. Verse 12. Then the detachment of troops, or the Roman cohort, and the captain, and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him. It was at this time that Jesus questioned the mob about his arrest. Why had they come with swords and clubs like they would if they were arresting a leader of an insurrection or a rebellion, especially since they could have arrested him at any time that he was teaching in the temple on a daily basis? I've been out, in the daylight there at the temple. Why didn't you arrest me then? If I'm guilty and you need weapons in order to arrest me. Once the arrest was made, all of the disciples deserted him and ran away. Again, John records none of that because it's already been recorded by the synoptics. Verse 13, and they led him away to Annas first, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was high priest that year. Now, none of the synoptic accounts mentions the preliminary meeting with Annas. John is the only one that tells us about this, because Annas had been the high priest years before. He was high priest from AD 6 through 15. He had 4 sons who followed him as high priests, as well as his son-in-law Caiaphas. Being head of the family, Annas was the power behind the high priests for decades. That's who, he was the older, he was looked at as being the legitimate high priest because the Romans were the ones that switched. You can't be high priest anymore. We're going to have your son do it, or we're going to have this son do it, or we're going to take your son-in-law and make him high priest. But, and so everybody still looked to Annas as being the chief guy. In fact, he seemed to have been the one who controlled the Sanhedrin. Verse 14, now it was Caiaphas who gave counsel to the Jews that it was expedient that one man should die for the people. We saw that back in chapter 11, toward the end of chapter 11, where Caiaphas made that statement. He was the high priest from AD 18 through 36. So he would still be high priest for several more years after this event that's recorded in the Scripture. He had determined that Jesus, back there in chapter 11, he had determined that Jesus should be put to death after he had raised Lazarus from the dead because of the attention that resurrection drew and what the Romans would do to the Jews if the number of people who continued to join in the following of Jesus, if it continued to mushroom like it was. Because word spread, he raised a man from the dead. And so Caiaphas says, we can't stand for this because the Romans will come and they will attack and we'll lose our positions as being the leaders of the people, etc., etc. All right, verse 15. And Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. Now that disciple was known to the high priest and went with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. The disciple with Peter, of course, was John. John never mentions himself by name in that respect. His family was apparently fairly wealthy. Talks about their servants and their fishing fleet, Zebedee's fishing fleet and so forth. And possibly he was related to the high priest family by marriage. Remember, John's mother, Salome, was a sister of Mary, the mother of Jesus. So, they were cousins. And they were also related to Elizabeth, or Mary was related to Elizabeth, and her sister Salome was therefore related to Elizabeth, who was the mother of John the Baptist, whose husband Zachariah was what? A priest. So we see there's a tie-in with families with the priesthood. So John was allowed in without question because of his connection with the high priest. Verse 16 goes on, but Peter stood at the door outside. John came right in because he was recognized. Peter, nope. Then the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out and spoke to her who kept the door and brought Peter in. Then the servant girl who kept the door said to Peter, you are not also one of this man's disciples, are you? He said, I am not. Now this was Peter's first denial. The account in Mark adds more details. Peter was by the fire, according to Mark, in order to warm himself, which means that, as he turns around to, rotisserie his body, as most people do when it's cold outside, that made, whenever he turned and hit faced the fire, his face would stand out, be recognizable. After his denial, according to Mark, he left the fire and exited the courtyard and went over to a porch, probably that overlooks the city, at which time the rooster crowed for the first time. Remember, Mark says that the rooster crowed twice. And so this was the first time, after the first denial. We're told about, again, verse 18 is more of a parenthetical, and the servants and officers who had made a fire of coals stood there, for it was cold, and they warmed themselves. And Peter stood with them and warmed himself. And this, of course, is referring to what was going on when he was recognized. Now remember, the city of Jerusalem is at an elevation of 2,600 feet. That's, I can't remember which part, whether it's Mount Scopus or, which one. But anyway, 2,600 feet is the elevation. Well, we're in early springtime, and at night when it's clear, and that time of year, it's very chilly. And so you don't want to be standing out. Wouldn't be as cold as it is here right now outside, but it would still be cold enough. You'd need a fire. You need something to keep you warm. Verse 19, the high priest then, after Peter's first denial, the high priest then asked Jesus about his disciples and his doctrine or his teaching. The motive behind the questioning, or this questioning, was twofold. First of all, he needed to get some facts about the numbers of Jesus' followers so that he could use those facts, those tabulations, in accusations to Pilate about how many subversives Jesus had that were supporting him. And then, of course, he asked about his teaching to find out if there was something in his teaching about the kingdom of God that could be used or viewed by him as, and viewed by the Romans as a threat to Rome. Is his teaching saying we need to overthrow this government in order to establish my kingdom? Verse 20, Jesus answered him, I spoke openly to the world. I always taught in synagogues and in the temple, that is the temple courts, where the Jews always meet, and in secret I have said nothing. Why do you ask me? Ask those who have heard me what I said to them. Indeed, they know what I said. Ignoring the question pertaining to his disciples, Jesus only focused on the second question that he had. He asked Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. He only talked about the teaching. Jesus told Annas that his teachings were a matter of public record and reminded him that the proper legal procedure required witnesses to come forward with accusations before a meeting such as the one that they were having could ever be conducted. Jesus knew what the law was, and they were not abiding by their own law. They couldn't even try a criminal case on the day before the beginning of an annual festival. That was taboo. They weren't even supposed to do that. And here they were meeting at night, which was also taboo. You cannot have a nighttime meeting. And yet they were doing these things. Verse 22, the New American Standard translates, and when he had said this, one of the officers standing by gave Jesus a blow. The New English translation says, struck him on the face, saying, is that the way you answer the high priest? Jesus answered him, if I have spoken wrongly, bear witness of the wrong. Tell me what it is. But if rightly, why do you strike me? Now, Jesus had shown no disrespect in answering Annas. So he corrected the reaction of this officer. You're out of line, bud. You don't have a right to hit me. And so he still dominated things. He was in charge. Verse 24, then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. Now, John omits the account of the meeting with Caiaphas. This is all he tells us. Annas sent him over to Caiaphas. Neither does John refer to the meeting of the Sanhedrin that was held shortly after what took place at the home of Caiaphas. Both Matthew's and Mark's accounts relate the details of the meeting with Caiaphas, who sought false witnesses. That's what we find they recorded. He sought false witnesses to testify against Jesus. Eventually, two individuals came forward and claimed that Jesus had said that he could destroy the temple and that he could build it back without hands in 3 days. After that, Caiaphas demanded that Jesus answer the accusations, which led to what Mark records back in Mark chapter 14. Mark 14 and verse 61. Here in Mark 14, verse 61, but he kept silent and answered nothing. After the false witnesses, and Caiaphas says, well, what do you have to say about this? He said nothing. Again, the high priest asked him, saying to him, are you the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed? And Jesus said, I am. And you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the power. You know, he uses euphemisms for God so that he does not commit blasphemy here. And coming with the clouds of heaven. Then the high priest tore his clothes and said, what further need do we have of witnesses? You have heard the blasphemy. What do you think? And they all condemned him to be worthy of death. Then some began to spit on him and to blindfold him and to beat him and to say, prophesy. And the soldiers struck him with the palms of their hands, or the officers with their hands. So, Mark fills in some important details there that we don't have in other places. All right, in John 18 again, verse 25, the New International translates, as Simon Peter stood warming himself, he was asked, you are not one of his disciples, are you? He denied it again. He denied it, saying, I am not. Now, this was Peter's second denial. The account in Matthew reveals that Peter used an oath when he made this second denial. John does not give us that information, but Matthew's account does. Verse 26, one of the servants of the high priest, a relative of him whose ear Peter cut off, said, did I not see you in the garden with him? Now, a relative generally takes more notice of someone who attacks, a relation, who injures a blood relative. You know, they're going to be a little more keen on things. Added to this, Peter drew a lot of attention to himself, with lanterns that they were holding when he used that sword. So he stood out much more than John or James did. Peter stood out because of what he had done. Verse 27, then Peter denied again. This is the third time. And immediately a rooster crowed. The accounts of Matthew and Mark state that Peter began this time to curse and to swear. He did so in order to convince the people who continued to question him of his denial. No, I do not know him. Blankety blank, blank, blank. That's what he did. The account in Luke gives some additional information about this event. Luke 22 and verse 60. But Peter said, man, I do not know what you are saying. And immediately, while he was still speaking, the rooster crowed. And the Lord turned and looked at Peter. And Peter remembered the word of the Lord, how he had said to him, before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. Then Peter went out and wept bitterly. All right, John, once he says Peter denied him again, immediately the rooster crowed. That's it. He doesn't give us any other details. So, again, we have to pick those up in the synoptic accounts. Now, after abusing Jesus until daylight arrived, which was necessary, the daylight, for a legal meeting to be held, the priests and the elders who had participated in the assembly at Caiaphas' home convened a meeting with the other members of the Sanhedrin. And it seems that those members had been called to come to Caiaphas' house. And that's where this probably outdoor meeting occurred. In Mark 15, verse 1, Mark 15:1, it says, "Immediately in the morning, the chief priests held a consultation with the elders and scribes and the whole council, and they bound Jesus." So that was after the official meeting, quote unquote, of the Sanhedrin. Back in chapter 18, verse 28 of John, continuing in the New International Translation, "Then the Jews led Jesus from Caiaphas to the palace of the Roman governor," or the praetorium, as it's called. The Complete Jewish Bible translates it the governor's headquarters. It was at this time that Judas learned Jesus had been condemned by the Sanhedrin, and being overcome with guilt, he returned the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders. That's brought out in Matthew chapter 27. So that was when that occurred, according to Matthew. Going on in verse 28, New International, "By now it was early morning, and to avoid ceremonial uncleanness, the Jews did not enter the palace. They wanted to be able to eat the Passover. According to rabbinic law, any Jew who entered a Gentile home would become ceremonially unclean, and they would require purification before they could have any dealings at the temple. The Passover lambs would be killed that afternoon and eaten after sunset in the Passover meal." Verse 29, going on again in the New International. "So Pilate came out to them." They wouldn't go into him. He came out to them and asked, "What charges are you bringing against this man?" Now, unlike the synoptic accounts, which focus on the charges, that's the primary focus on the charges against Jesus, John deals more with the effect that Jesus had on Pilate. The others don't really bring that out, but John does. In fact, he gives us a longer section dealing with the interaction between Jesus and Pilate. Verse 30, "They answered and said to him, 'If he were not an evildoer or a criminal,' some translations have, 'we would not have delivered him up to you.'" The religious leaders basically told Pilate, "Look, we've already judged him. The judging has already been done." They were not asking Pilate to be a judge, but rather to be the executioner of their judgment, what they had already decided. Now, John omits what takes place next, as recorded by Luke. After the Jews accused Jesus of perverting the nation, of forbidding the payment of taxes to Caesar, and claiming to be a king, after all of these accusations were made, Pilate questioned Jesus and said, "I find no fault in him. I can't find any evidence here of any of these things." Then the mob became more indignant, and they accused Jesus of stirring up the people all the way from Galilee to Judea, from north to south. Upon hearing that, Pilate asked if Jesus were a Galilean. Finding that to be the case, he sent Jesus, of course, with the Jews and temple officers, sent him to Herod Antipas, who was also in the city for Passover. Herod questioned Jesus, who refused to respond to any of Herod's questions. Frustrated by Jesus' silence on the one hand and the vehement accusations that were being screamed at him by the chief priests and scribes on the other hand, Herod treated Jesus with contempt and ridicule before sending him back to Pilate wearing a very elegant robe. That's what we're told in Luke chapter 23. All right, back to chapter 18, verse 31. "Then Pilate said to them, 'You take him and judge him according to your law.'" Well, they had already judged him, though not according to their law, which prohibited the things that they had done earlier. during the nighttime and even after sunrise. What they had done was not allowed by their law. They could not try an individual criminally on a day, a preparation day, before an annual festival or the Sabbath. It was not to be allowed. But the Jews, therefore, said to him, "It is not lawful for us to put anyone to death." Their claim was it was unlawful for them to put anyone to death in context with the crime of sedition against Rome, and that's what they were accusing him of. The Romans would allow them to put a blasphemer to death. I mean, they had to go to the Romans and get permission to do it, but they would allow the Jews to be the ones to do the stoning. Verse 32. Again, it is not lawful for us. The Jews said it's not lawful for us to put anyone to death, that the saying of Jesus might be fulfilled, which he spoke, signifying by what death he would die. Well, Jesus could not die by stoning. And that's how the Jews would put him to death. He had already mentioned 3 times in chapter 3, chapter 8, chapter 12, basically that he would die after being raised up. That, of course, was descriptive of a Roman crucifixion. David prophesied back in Psalm 22 the manner of death for the Messiah when he wrote that they pierced my hands and my feet, and that could only be attributed to a Roman crucifixion. So, it was required from prophecy that he had to be crucified, and when he came, he brought that up a number of times, as we've seen going through the book of John. Verse 33, then Pilate entered the praetorium again, called Jesus, and said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered him, "Are you speaking for yourself on this, or did others tell you this about me?" Pilate asked the question because members of the Sanhedrin had accused Jesus of saying that he was their king. He had claimed to be their king. He had claimed to be the Messiah. Jesus put Pilate on the spot. Had Pilate sought out witnesses, eyewitness testimony? Have you done basically what you're expected to do as a judge? Or have you only taken the accusations of a lynch mob? What have you done? Are you doing this correctly? Pilate answered, verse 35, "Am I a Jew? Your own nation, your own people," Goodspeed says, "and the chief priests have delivered you to me. What have you done?" Pilate admitted he was not fully educated about the Messiah, who was to be the king of Israel. That was something that only a Jew would understand. If Jesus had not been guilty of subversion, as his accusers implied, what was causing their unbelievably irrational behavior? Why were they like a pack of rabid dogs, this early in the morning? He couldn't understand. Verse 36, Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight, so that I should not be delivered to the Jews. But now, this time in the history of this world, my kingdom is not from here." Jesus did not deny that he was a king, but he pointed out that just as he is not of this world, neither is his kingdom of the present world. He emphasized that he was not leading his subjects against Rome. He was not leading them in opposition to the Caesar. Pilate, therefore, verse 37, said to him, "Are you a king then?" Jesus answered, "You say rightly that I am a king. For this cause I was born." Well, this was one of the causes for sure. "For this cause I was born, and for this cause I have come into the world, that I should bear witness to the truth." And that means in every form. The witness to the truth that the prophecy said a Messiah would come, lay down his life, everything. Okay? "I should bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice." Jesus' role as king was prophesied from the time of Jacob forward. Remember when Jacob blessed his 12 sons, and they were all prophecies, how the scepter would not leave Judah until Shiloh came, etc. I mean, he's talking about the coming of the one who would take the rule and rule forever. And so that goes all the way back to Jacob. He was descended from David, prophesied to sit on David's throne as the Messiah. His kingly role is to be king over all nations, the one who will teach the truth of God's plan to all people. We have an example of that in the millennium back in Isaiah chapter 2, verses 2 through 4. They'll all come up. They want to learn from him, and he will teach them the truth. Going on in verse 38, Pilate said to him, "What is truth?" You say that you've come to bring truth? What is truth? The Roman Empire was full of Greek sophists and other philosophers who all claimed to be the final word on truth. With this influence so widespread and what Pilate had encountered, he simply disregarded what Jesus had said. He wasn't interested in Jesus' truth any more than a lot of the other individuals who purported to know it all. And when he had said this, he went out again to the Jews, and he said to them, "I find no fault in him at all," or I find, New International, "I find no basis for a charge against him." Luke's account includes Pilate telling them that Herod also believed that Jesus had done nothing and was innocent. He had done nothing deserving of being executed. So, as a result, based upon Pilate agreeing with Herod, Pilate said, "Look, I'm just going to chastise him, and then I'm going to release him." That Luke tells us that back in Luke 23 in his account. Verse 39, "But you have a custom that I should release someone to you at the Passover. Do you therefore want me to release to you the King of the Jews?" The Roman governor, who had the authority to grant amnesty to anyone that he decided, had made this an annual practice in Judea to take place at the time of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. The people were given the privilege of choosing the one who would be granted that freedom at that particular time. And they reminded, in Mark's account, they reminded Pilate of that practice, basically before Pilate offered, "Do you want me to release the King of the Jews?" According to the account in Matthew, chief priests and elders used their positions to influence the crowd, which was probably largely pre-selected or at least heavily seated with people who were loyal to the high priest and would do whatever the high priest told them to do. And they were told to ask for Barabbas and put Jesus to death. That's what they were told to say. Now, Matthew's account also indicates that about this time, Pilate received a message from his wife, telling him that he should leave Jesus alone because she had a terrible nightmare that night. And that in that nightmare it was revealed that Jesus was an innocent man and that her husband should do nothing to harm him. All right, verse 40. "Then they all cried again, saying, 'Not this man, but Barabbas.'" Now, people say Barabbas. It needs to be, the emphasis is bar, which means son of, Abbas. And, of course, that means of the father or of the master. "Not this man, but Barabbas." Now, Barabbas was a robber, or he had been taken in a rebellion, the New International says. Barabbas was imprisoned for being an insurrectionist and a murderer, according to Mark and according to Luke. The name Barabbas is Aramaic and, again, means son of the father. Son of the father, Barabbas, son of the father. Interesting the meaning of the name of this criminal. Here the people demanded that the son of the father of this cosmos, who's the father of this cosmos? Jesus says, you're of your father, the devil. You know, back earlier in chapter 8 of John, talking about the high priest and the rest of the religious leaders who were against him. Well, here the people demanded the son of the father of this cosmos, who is from below, to be released. And that the true son of the Father, who is not of this cosmos, not of this world, but who is from above, they demanded him to be crucified. Now, this demonstrates the impact of what Jesus had taught the disciples earlier in chapter 15, when he said, if one is of this world, they will be hated, or they will be loved. But if one is not of this world, they will be hated. He says, this is what you're going to experience, and that's exactly what Jesus is experiencing here. So what he had told them just hours before was coming to pass at this very moment. All right, chapter 19, verse 1. So then Pilate took Jesus and scourged him, or had him flogged, the Revised English Bible has. There were three types of scourging administered during the first century A.D. The first kind was dispensed for minor infractions, was the least severe. It was done primarily to humiliate people because they had done something that was not, not according to the law, but it wasn't real serious. And so they flogged them, and it was more to humiliate. The second type of flogging, which was pretty much what the Jews did, the 39 lashes, the 40 lashes, or stripes save one, like the Apostle Paul had that happen 5 times to him. All right, well, the second was used to punish criminals who committed more serious violations of the law, and it was dealt out with greater brutality than the first. The third type of scourging was administered by the Romans for capital offenses after a criminal was sentenced. The criminal was sentenced, then they were scourged. And that scourging was inhumanely brutal and many times fatal. Now, in some cases, people were scourged to death purposely because of a capital offense. Other times, it was the prerequisite. You were given the death sentence to be crucified. You had to be scourged. And if you died, so what? But generally, they wanted to crucify. So they could see that they're close to death, they would stop so that they could nail him up or tie him up in order to die on a stake. The Greek word translated scourged in this verse is mastago, which refers to being whipped or beaten and seems most likely to describe the second type of scourging. Now, it could be a reference to the Roman. I don't think so, and I'll tell you why. This indicates the possibility that despite the calls to release Barabbas from the mob due to his wife's warning, Pilate still considered following through with his proposed compromise of chastising Jesus, of simply beating him and then releasing him after presenting him to the mob, because that's what he had told them earlier. In Luke chapter 23, Luke records that, okay, well, I'll chastise him and then I'll release him to you. And that's what he wanted to do, especially after his wife's warning. Verse 2, and the soldiers twisted a crown of thorns and put it on his head. This was after he was flogged or scourged. And they put on him a purple robe. Then they said, "Hail, King of the Jews," and they struck him with their hands. Now, as with Herod's men, the Roman soldiers also did all in their power to humiliate Jesus. According to the accounts of Matthew and Mark, they only hit him with a reed. They didn't use their hands. And I believe it's because this happened twice on two occasions. Verse 4, Pilate then went out again and said to them, Behold, I am bringing him out to you that you may know that I find no fault in him. Now, he's had him scourged, but he still says he's innocent. Then Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, and Pilate said to them, Behold the man. Notice, he's wearing the crown of thorns and the robe, and he's appearing before the people. This is John's account. You're going to find Matthew and Mark have it at a different time. Okay? So here he comes out. Now, he said, Behold the man. Though not knowing the scriptural implication of what he said, Pilate here proclaimed Jesus as the Messiah to all of the religious leaders of the Jews. How is that? Because Zechariah had prophesied. Back in Zechariah chapter 6, verse 12, the prophecy is, Behold the man, whose name is the branch, and he shall grow up out of his place, and he shall build the temple of the Lord. All right, so when Pilate said this, Behold the man, he didn't realize he was basically referring to a messianic prophecy. The branch from David, again, this is what he did. And so God, no doubt, moved him to say those words on account of the religious leaders, because he's laying down the groundwork of how dastardly their deed was. Verse 6, Therefore, when the chief priests and officers, or the temple police, as the Revised English Bible brings out, saw him, they cried out, saying, Crucify him, crucify him. Pilate said to them, You take him and crucify him, for I find no fault in him. Or again, the New International, I find no basis for a charge against him. Pilate told them that he did not agree with their conclusion that Jesus was an insurrectionist or deserving of death. This indicates that Pilate had not yet rendered a death sentence. There had been no sentencing up to this point. Verse 7, The Jews answered him, We have a law, and according to our law he ought to die, because he made himself, or he has claimed to be, the New Revised Standard, the Son of God. Now, the law to which they referred was the law against blasphemy, which required the death penalty. Verse 8, Therefore, when Pilate heard that saying, he was the more afraid. He was already afraid because of what his wife had told him, and now he's even greater afraid because of what they've said. The Son of God? And he went again into the praetorium and said to Jesus, Where are you from? But Jesus gave him no answer. So again, Pilate's fear was a compilation of factors. In addition to the Jews being in an unreasonable frenzy and what his wife had said, Pilate was also a polytheist. That is, he believed that there were many gods and goddesses, and sometimes they appeared among men. And the Jews' new claim of wanting Jesus crucified caused Pilate to be very leery of harming a man who might just be a supernatural being. And what would that being do to him if he rendered a death sentence? Verse 10, Then Pilate said to him, Are you not speaking to me? Do you not know that I have power to crucify you and power to release you? Jesus answered, You could have no power at all against me unless it had been given you from above. Therefore, the one who delivered me to you has the greater sin. Pilate's claim of authority was greatly undermined by the political pressures that he was under. He did have all the legal authority he claimed. He could release Jesus, no matter what the Jews wanted. But the Jewish religious leaders were here the ones who were in control. They were exerting control here. Pilate was an instrument used to fulfill a divine purpose. Pilate's sin was failing to use and exercise the power that God had granted him in his office to give and render a just verdict. Pilate did not want to render a just verdict here because of this crowd. The greater sin, however, that was his sin, the greater sin was upon the heads of Judas and Caiaphas and the rest of the Jewish religious leaders who were all aware of Jesus' innocence and yet were yelling and screaming, wanting his death. Verse 12, from then on, Pilate sought to release him. But the Jews cried out, saying, if you let this man go, you are not Caesar's friend. Whoever makes himself a king speaks against Caesar. Or the Revised English Bible has, whoever claims to be a king is opposing Caesar. So this was the final straw. Pilate could no longer ignore the threats of the religious leaders. Couldn't do it anymore. If he refused to fulfill the Jewish religious leaders' demands, the high priest could report him to Rome for refusing to deal with an insurrectionist who was a threat to the Emperor Tiberius. And that could lead to the end of Pilate's political aspirations and could even lead to his death, his termination. Verse 13, when Pilate therefore heard that saying, he brought Jesus out and sat down in the judgment seat in a place that is called the pavement, or the New Revised Standard, the stone pavement, the Moffat, the mosaic pavement, but in Hebrew simply called Gabbatha. The judgment seat was a throne from which official judicial verdicts were rendered by the governor, who happened at this time to be Pilate. It was placed on the Gabbatha. Gabbatha is a Hebrew word or Aramaic word that simply means a raised platform. So it was made out of stone, and since they found some mosaics on a raised platform in archaeological excavations, that's one reason that Moffat says a mosaic. Okay, it may and may not be, whatever the situation. All right, verse 14. Notice again. Now it was the preparation day of the Passover, and about the 6th hour. And he said to the Jews, behold your king. First thing he says from his judgment seat. John clearly states that this event took place on the preparation day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. That would be the 14th day of Nisan, the day preparations are made for the beginning of the annual festival of unleavened bread. This was the day when the remnant of all leavening and leavened products were burned early in the morning. By noon they had to all be burned. And it was also the day that the Passover lambs were slain in the afternoon and prepared along with the unleavened bread, the bitter herbs, and so on, for the Passover meal that was eaten at the start of the 15th day of Nisan. All right, John's very emphatic, and we're going to find that he's even more emphatic after probably next time, in the next installment of John. So, this was about the 6th hour, approximately 9 a.m. From the judgment seat, Pilate officially declared Jesus as king of the Jews. But, verse 15, they cried out, away with him, crucify him. Pilate said to them, shall I crucify your king? The chief priests answered, we have no king but Caesar. The leaders of the Jews affirmed their allegiance to the Roman emperor while betraying the true king of the Jewish nation. This fulfilled their their action here, we have no king but Caesar, this fulfilled one of the opening points that John made in this particular account. Back in chapter 1, verse 11, where he says that he came to his own. Came to his own people, and his own did not receive him. Nope, we'll take Caesar. We'll take that Roman king, that Roman emperor over the Messiah. They made that choice. One of Pilate's final acts before delivering Jesus to be crucified is recorded only by Matthew. That's in Matthew chapter 27 and verse 24. Matthew 27, verse 24. It says, when Pilate saw that he could not prevail at all, but rather that a tumult was rising, he took water, washed his hands before the multitude, saying, I am innocent of the blood of this just or righteous person. You see to it. You want to crucify him, it's on your head. And all the people answered and said, his blood be on us and on our children. Chapter 19 of John, verse 16. So he, Pilate, delivered him to be crucified. So they took Jesus and led him away. Now, this was when John says the decision was made that he would be crucified. The accounts of Matthew and Mark omit many of the details related by John. They either summarized the same events or they recorded similar but different events. And I guarantee you they're similar, but not the same, not exactly the same. They mention nothing of the fear that Pilate experienced, which was driving him to do all he could to release Jesus. They don't bring any of that out. They simply state that Pilate released Barabbas before delivering Jesus to be crucified. He had him scourged. That's all that they say. Before delivering him, he had him scourged. The Greek word they used for scourge was flagello, which best describes, of course, the third type of scourging, the application of the Roman scourge, flagellum, which consisted of several rawhide straps attached to a wooden handle, and the straps had very sharp pieces of metal or bone that was embedded in those straps so that they literally could peel the skin right off of a body. This was the most brutal type of scourging. It inflicted so much pain that those who were sentenced to death by crucifixion generally went into shock from just the pain, and there was considerable loss of blood, but not to the same extent as being lacerated an artery or whatever. The accounts of Matthew and Mark mention nothing of Pilate officially rendering his verdict from the judgment seat, which was required when ordering death by crucifixion. And they place the time of the harsh treatment of Jesus by the Roman soldiers after he was led away to be crucified. You read their accounts, it's not till they led him away to be crucified that they put the crown of thorns on his head, that they put the robe on him. Nothing there. John indicates the harsh treatment of Jesus, which included Roman soldiers hitting him with their hands. We read that back up here in verse 3. Okay, so John says they put the crown on, and then they began hitting him with their hands, and that was done prior to leading him out to the Gabbatha before the judgment seat. Okay, when Pilate brought him out and told them, here's your king. Okay, so he appeared before them with the crown of thorns and the robe. However, the accounts of Matthew and Mark are a little different. They specifically state that once the Roman soldiers finished ridiculing, spitting on, and beating on Jesus with the reed. They didn't use their hands. They gave him a reed which represented a scepter. It was a sham scepter. They put a robe on him, like a king. They put this crown of thorns, and they gave him this reed, this very heavy reed to hold like a scepter. And then they took that from him, and they used that to beat him, not with their hands. So they give us a totally different picture here. And immediately after they did that, they pulled the robe off and put his own clothes back on him, and then led him off to be crucified. Nothing about all of this and then taking him out before the people. All right, so I think there's two different occasions here. Even though there may have been only one time, could be just one time that Jesus was scourged, John's account seems to record only an earlier chastisement, because Pilate was, after he flogged him, was intending to let him go. Still was intending to let him go. And so it seems that was what happened rather than the inhumane scourging that the accounts of Matthew and Mark record. This means that there may have been two separate scourgings. The one after releasing Barabbas in Pilate's attempt to satisfy the mob, and the second one after Pilate rendered his verdict from the judgment seat. John records the first, as we've seen here in chapter 19, verse 1. Matthew and Mark record the second. Since John records Jesus appearing before the crowd wearing a crown of thorns and a robe that Roman soldiers had put on him after flogging him, and the two synoptic accounts record him being clothed by the whole garrison. They specified that the whole they called all the garrison in. The whole garrison of Roman soldiers came in to the praetorium, and they participated in the same manner. After he was led back in from the Gabbatha, he was led back into the praetorium when, Pilate says, he's yours to do with. Roman soldiers took him back in the praetorium. It seems that once he was back there, he was stripped of his clothes. Then he was scourged with the Roman scourge, inhumanely. And it seems that after that, they finished that. They again dressed him in the robe and the crown of thorns that he had worn out before the people. Then they gave him the reed. And then, of course, they ridiculed him more. Then they took the clothes off, the robe, the crown of thorns, and put his other clothes back on and led him away. So, I think that's the way it went down. But it doesn't really matter. He was scourged. And he was scourged brutally. It's just hard to imagine that what Pilate did here in John was to that extent, when all the time he was planning to release him if at all possible. So that brings us to the close of the material today.